Good morning. This is Wednesday morning, isn't it? We made it that far. Halfway through the first week. I'm Lee Stevens, and I am substituting for Ruth Ann, who's on vacation. No problems. Just gone away to enjoy a couple of weeks of lying out in the sun and such. But she's still in town. I know that. I saw her last night at Peter Pan. 737-9522 is that number if you don't have it written down. I have a very interesting guest this morning to begin with. Mr. Tom Armstrong, who is an author. He's worked in radio, in print media. He's written plays, songs, television and film work. I guess about the broadest spectrum of writing one can do in everything. You didn't write poems down here either. I guess you put that under print. Tom, let's find out a bit about you personally first. You are now living in Nashville.
I've been living here since 1976.
So you are pretty much native by now. That's about the length of time it takes. How are Mike's? He's very soft-spoken. You want him closer? Okay, you need to get a little closer. Before you came to Nashville, where were you?
All of my background prior to Nashville was in Los Angeles. I met my wife there and came back to Nashville because her family is from this area. And I love living here. I wouldn't move back for anything in the world.
Let's talk about where you started as a writer.
Basically, Lee, I started my desire to write when I was about 8 years old. I've told my wife this story, but what it amounted to, I got on well in school and enjoyed sports, etc., but I always had a sense of alienation, I think, particularly in the grade school days. And I remember thinking when I was about 8, well, if I'm not really a people, I'll write about them. I became fascinated with a great deal of reading at that point and started writing when I was about 9. Of course, a lot of that never came to anything. I continued to do that, was a journalism major in college, and then went to USC School of Cinema, and then started writing when I got out of that.
Now, even though you weren't in Nashville, did you have any connection with country music in particular?
Strangely enough, I did, although my background was totally non-country. I had always loved country music, primarily because in fact, I have an article on this that I'm quite proud of. I believe country music to be the most literate form of music extant. By that, I do not necessarily mean that it's the best, although it happens to be my favorite, but I mean that it uses words better than any other song form. A lot of people would tend to consider classical music as an example literate, but of course it technically isn't because it does not use words. Grand opera, if one is writing a lyric line for grand opera and the primary or best choice of word is consonant-laden and the second best is filled with vowels, you would go with the second best so the singer can open his throat and get that cascading sound out. In country, as they say, they tell it like it is. So you find songs that have, to me, choice word usage, wordplay, great story songs, etc. Also, I like country because I feel very often the songs are extremely valid. There's a song as an example that I had no connection with, but called Old Flames Can't Hold a Candle to You. I like it not only because of the wordplay, but because I think every couple romantically involved, even as early as the 3rd or 4th grade, thinks, well, she probably liked Little Johnny better than she likes me. And so it's a very reassuring thing. If a non-singer were sitting in a restaurant with somebody he loved and said, Old Flames Can't Hold a Candle to You, the line would be very valid. So I love that type of thing in country music. And long before I came to Nashville, had a great love for country.
Country music does seem, in its lyric content, to play with words like no other song form does. You'll hear it occasionally in rock music and pop music and such, but almost every country song depends on its use of wordplay. I think the George Jones song, He Stopped Loving Her Today, is very well done because it never really tells you exactly what's happening until you realize toward the end. And that's one of the things that I like about country music so much is that wordplay. In fact, that's what I do. You have written, let's start at the point that you became a writer professionally, which is probably right out of school or even while you were in school.
Right. The first writing I did, Lee, I do not sing, dance, pick, direct, produce, or do anything but write, and that's probably why I became interested in writing in many different fields. But of course I wanted to start out doing the great American novel and had neither the talent nor the political clout to get into that right away. What I did originally, I worked in the ad agency business, and at that time I think erroneously felt a little inferior because I was writing advertising copy instead of great novels or films. I have learned to cherish and treasure that experience. Working as a copywriter gave me a great deal of experience with condensing audiovisual copy or print copy into a short amount of space and telling a story. Then after I got out of that, I went into journalism for a time and worked in the newspaper business and in radio. I did radio writing in Houston, in New Orleans, in the South Pacific when I was in the service. And then later, of course, that came into play because after I moved to Nashville, the Drake Chenault organization in Los Angeles contacted me regarding a show called The History of Country Music. Well, I had been working with Beverly Beard, who is actually Beverly Beard Armstrong, my wife, and was a writer before I married her, and a great Nashville songwriter who passed away a couple years back, a member of the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame, Vic McAlpin, on a print history of country. So I was very charmed by the idea of working on the radio show, and basically what the show did, it was called The History of Country Music and took country from its birth in America up through the 1980s. The show was syndicated nationally. It did, by the way, we're fortunate. Ralph Emery did the voice on it. Chet Atkins did the theme. The show has done very well in the ratings in Los Angeles and all over the country. I know some of the stations have gone up 5 and 7 points. It just finished playing locally on WSM. And Ralph, of course, was well known to that audience. But in any event, I very much enjoyed doing that radio history. And while we were doing it, I was head writer on the show. The other writers were Beverly Beard and Michael Kosser, who is a member of the board of directors of the Nashville Songwriters Association. He's a well-known Nashville songwriter and journalist. And Bev and Mike and I worked well with the Country Music Foundation, which, by the way, is highly praiseworthy for all of the obvious reasons, but more importantly, even more so I would say than the American Film Institute in Hollywood, the Country Music Foundation has a tremendous staff, tremendous resources, and they're very cooperative. Bill Ivey over there, Danny Hatcher, Ronnie Pugh, the personnel were just a joy to work with, and I'm very, very proud of the radio history. The book, by the way, should be coming out from Crown Publishing in New York in 1984. The research there has been monumental. We actually took country back before its actual birth, you might say back to its gestation period, through not only the often written about Anglo-Celt influences, but we went as far back as we could, almost to the point of absurdity, back to the year 750, and then worked forward. And there were country music was not extant then, but there were influences extant then, and other things that, of course, relate very much to the industry today. Publishing, as an example, in America really started in this country in the mid-1600s. The first printing press in America was at Harvard University, which was then Harvard College. And when they got the press, almost the first thing that was done was some song printing. So that type of information does have an indirect connection to country, and then of course once you get into the early 1900s, it's just a veritable gold mine of really enchanting information. So in any event, the book is called From Defeated Creek to Music City, USA, and tied around the life of songwriter Vic McAlpin, and it's just a delightful book to write.
It is not biographical, though, of him particularly?
In a sense, it is. The way the book came to be was that Vic has been around music. Well, he was here even before Hank Williams Sr. and knew Hank well. In fact, co-wrote some songs with Hank. He was very close to Fred Rose and Hank Sr. and has known most of the country music greats. When we started the book, it was almost entirely biographical. But as Vic and Bev and I talked about the book, we had decided that a nice thing to do would be to use Vic's life as a clothesline, and as singer A or B or publisher A or B came to town and Vic met them, we then go into their story. So what the book now is a really good overview history of country from its very birth up into the present time.
Okay, we need to take a break right here, Tom. We'll be back in just a moment. Our number is 737. We get talking during these breaks and forget about you folks sometimes. It's now 17 minutes past 9 o'clock. My guest this morning is Tom Armstrong. Tom is a writer of many, many different things. He's written for radio, print. He has a play coming to Broadway. When do you think that will be ready? Let's go ahead and talk about the Broadway show that you have coming up.
The Broadway show basically, Lee, should open in 1984. I want to stress the word should because where we stand at this point, the play is called It's a Funny Old World. I co-wrote the book of the play with Beverly Beard. The music and lyrics I co-wrote with Beverly Beard and a legendary Nashvilleian who's a real gentleman, Harold Bradley. What we have done at this point, we have had the play optioned. We have signed and had countersigned by the Dramatist Guild all of the contracts on the play. What now stands in the way of opening, this is not negative news, this is true with all Broadway shows today, is that due in part to inflation, budgets are high. The budget on our show, as an example, is $2.3 million. So what the producers are now doing is getting together the 2.3, which I don't have, and when they get the money up, then we will go into casting and sizing up the theater, etc. But we're very pleased to be at the point we're at now because, frankly, when I mentioned a diverse background in writing, there was an area of naivete. I had done theater before with straight dramatic plays, and I love working in theater. However, I had never had, and still don't have, of course, a Broadway show. So what we did when we had the show written, and we did the demos at Bradley's barn just before the barn burned down, and it was a delight to have them once again just because of the historical aura of it. But we took the demos in the book and went to New York and thought, well, we'll be gone about 2 weeks and come back with the producer. We were actually gone 3 months and almost lived out the stereotype film of knocking on doors, waiting for phone calls, etc. But we did finally get the package together. So now what we're waiting for, Lee, is the timing on the budget, getting all the money in, and then going into rehearsal and casting.
Who's producing the show?
Basically, at this point, we have Soloway and Francis. They've been involved in over 100 Broadway shows. In fact, some big shows. The Shadow Box was a Pulitzer Prize winner for them, example.
And now, you did not mention, but this is a country music.
Very definitely a country musical. Most of my background in theater, as I say, had been with straight dramatic plays. But what had happened at one point in my career, I was doing some writing for Smothers Brothers, and Tom Smothers was not directly involved in the musical Hair, but he had invested in the show, and by the way, made an excellent return on his investment. Well, I saw the show through him about 7 times, loved particularly the opening part of that show, but as I had mentioned earlier, even then I was totally taken with country music, and it dawned on me that if country songs work so well as story songs and wordplay songs, country music should be ideal for theater. I still believe that, and I'm not speaking in any way presumptuously about anything I write. I think this would be true for all writers. I think country music is ideal for Broadway theater, and I think the day will come when we will see a number of country shows on Broadway. We're starting to now, as a matter of fact. There have been Pump Boys and Dinettes, as you're aware, went from off-Broadway to Broadway. Some people had considered Oklahoma country. Of course, that would not be true, but it did pave the way, so to speak. Tex Ritter, by the way, was on a Broadway show in 1931, very early in his career.
Green Grow the Lilacs.
Right, that's it.
That wasn't musical, though, was it?
Not really, although people associate it because of Tex and his subsequent career.
Now, when you say it's going to be country music, oftentimes Broadway show will have country-flavored music, really, rather than country music. Is yours going to be more straight country in its presentation, or will you have the big orchestra in the pit?
It'll be a combination of both. One of the blessings of working with Harold Bradley, Harold has been, as you probably know, Lee, one of the studio musicians who has attracted international attention, actually, for his studio work in country music over a period of years. And because of his intimate knowledge, that's actually one of the reasons. Partly was just his personality and his talent, but one of the reasons that Beverly and I wanted to work with Harold was the fact that he had a good feeling for country in many diverse forms. And this show will have, very candidly, some that are full orchestra type sounds, but we'll have also the spectrum from country rock to country pop to straight country ballad, etc.
Large cast?
Fairly large cast. When I look back on it, opposed to any other media I've ever worked in other than print, the writer in Broadway theater has theoretically the ultimate say. However, in point of fact, I don't think that will be the case, not because we're being pushed around, manipulated, or overpowered, but simply because, as I admitted earlier, I've never had a Broadway show. I would rather bow to the people that truly know Broadway and go with them. Also, it's been my experience that despite all of the jokes about producers, or even in the music business, publishers, directors, etc., I have found most of those people, as I've found most critics, a delight to work with. Generally, they've been very helpful to me. And there have been cases where I would have miscast. I had one play I remember called God and Man in Jail. One of the actors who did beautiful cold readings, and at that point I was not truly acquainted with how well some people can do cold readings and then not grow, far surpassed another actor who did a very rough reading. But the casting director and the director knew enough about that theater and that actor to realize this man will grow with the role, and he did indeed. I now can hardly imagine anyone playing the part as well as he played it.
I think we need to take a break here. All right. WLAC, I'm Lee Stevens, and this is the Ruth Ann Leach Show. Our number is 737-9522 if you'd like to call and get in on the conversation. We're speaking with author Tom Armstrong, who has written in, I guess, every media you can write in. I don't think you've left a thing out. You've written poetry, you've written plays. You haven't written that great American novel yet. Perhaps that's the only thing you've missed. You have written short stories.
Yes.
And you wrote for the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour.
What happened on the Smothers Brothers was that when I was living in Los Angeles, I liked very much the type of comedy they were doing. I've actually written a great deal of comedy for a number of comics and for a number of television shows. But they did the type of comedy that I like. I actually like premise comedy, and comedy very often with throwaway lines, Woody Allen type things. And one of the things I learned early on, Lee, I sometimes would write lines that I thought were hilarious, and they were not. Then secondly, I would sometimes write lines that were truly funny, but they were not funny for the comic I was pitching. So I learned to match my material and to look for jobs, or gigs, if you will, where the writing matched the person delivering them. In fact, as I say, when I moved here, within 3 months of living in Nashville, the city, the environment, particularly the people of Nashville have been so warm and good to me, and I find a real charm here. I also like the change in seasons. I just like the environment. And another feeling that I have, this is just personal opinion, but I think this is a good base for a writer. I think that for a number of reasons, but one of them is, correctly or incorrectly, many of the trends and fads in this country start on the coast, either in New York or LA. And I think that by the time they get to Middle America, a lot of the chaff has fallen off of the wheat. And I think the vision may be a bit better here. I truly believe that. Saul Bellow is an example, who is certainly one of our leading writers, a Nobel Prize winner, etc., has remained in Chicago, and throughout his career he's had pressure on him to move to New York, because many people feel if you're a leading member of the literary community, you should live in New York. And he's proven that that need not be the case. There's a great American writer, a Southerner, born in Alabama, Walker Percy, who now lives in Lake Pontchartrain, Louisiana. And I think his work, which is truly interesting from a sociological point of view, I think it has a great vision. And Tennessee has a strong literary history. Not only Alan Tate and the Fugitive Movement, but James Agee, who is deceased now, of course, but wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel A Death in the Family. He also did some great screenplays. I think one of Bogart's best films was African Queen, and James Agee was on the screenplay to that. And then there are recent writers, Lisa Alter, who wrote Ken Flicks and Original Sin. She's from the Tri-Cities area of Tennessee, and I think a great writer. MTSU has a professor named Robert Herring, who's just come out with the first novel called HUD. And Hub has had great reviews, and from strong critics, the New York Times Book Review, etc., etc. And then right here in Nashville, we have writers Tom T. Hall, who is known as the storyteller, etc., has a novel out called The Laughing Man of Wolves, which is a truly charming novel. Barry Sadler has a successful series called the Casca series of books. There are writers who have not been published as yet, but I've seen the manuscripts and I think are going to do great. There's a writer in town named Jim Helm who has 4 manuscripts already, and I truly think that he's going to do extremely well.
I hate to break in, but let's not keep this caller waiting too long. Hello, you're live on WLAC.
Yes. I met Tom back when he first came to Nashville several years ago. He may or may not remember me, but I wanted to ask him, was his first ambition when he came to Nashville to write songs, or was he thinking more of writing plays or books when he first came here?
When I first came to Nashville, I hate to confess this, I came for the wrong reason. My wife, Beverly, who, as I mentioned, is also my co-writer, her family is from Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, and the Ozarks of Missouri. I had selfishly thought I will go to Nashville just long enough to do the country music from the Music City, USA base, and then move back to L.A. But as I mentioned earlier, I saw the error of my ways, and within 3 months, truly fell in love with this community and remain so. I did come candidly originally to do the country musical. However, now I'm doing all of the writing. In fact, when Lee mentioned the novel a little earlier, the country music history that we did with Vic McAlpin is coming out through Crown Publishing in New York. I also do have a novel that will be following that out, and 98% of that has been written in Nashville, and I think it's been healthy for me to do it here.
So your first ambition was to write a play, and then after you got here, you liked the country music end of it so well, and the people, you decided, hey, why not a country music play, right?
No, I had decided to do a country music play while I was still in Los Angeles, and had come here because I thought if one is going to do a country musical, politically it would be wise to do it in Nashville. I'm a bit ashamed of, that I thought it was strictly for political reasons, but once I came to this community, I loved it so dearly I thought, hey, this is where I want to live.
Now, do most plays, or do all movies start out as plays on Broadway?
Do all movies start out as plays on Broadway?
No, not at all.
Okay, would you say that the majority of them start out as a play on Broadway before it's adapted to movie?
The majority of musical?
No, well, the majority of any type movie. Or is it just musical plays that they have on Broadway?
No. Far and away the majority of all films are from original screenplays, and they not only don't start on Broadway or in theater, but most of them are not musical. I'm a member of the Writers Guild of America. There are approximately 6,000 members of that. Most of them are pushing original screenplays. However, if you have a screenplay that is based on yours or somebody else's musical or straight dramatic play, you get a lot more mileage out of it and generally get bigger bucks on it because they feel that it has a pre-sold audience. The same is true if you're doing an adaptation of a novel, if the novel was successful.
Uh-huh. Well, I'm quite aware of you and your writing and Mike Kosser, and is Mike listening this morning?
I believe that Michael is out of town this week, unfortunately.
Well, I met you back when you worked at, you were in and out of L.E. White's office over in the Tree Building several times with Vic McAlpin.
Right.
I'm the tall guy that shaves his head.
I remember you well. Is your name John Riggs?
And I wish you all the luck in the world.
John, I thank you much.
Work hard, and I know you're very conscientious with what you're doing, and you're very sincere about it, and I just wish you all the luck anybody could possibly have with your play.
That's very kind of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, let's get back to the film. You have known personally a great many of the writers that you mentioned from your work in L.A. and such.
Right.
some more intimately than others, I'm sure.
Right.
Who are some of the film writers that you most respect?
Probably the ones I have a great respect for Horton Foote, who has a film out now called Tender Mercies. I have also, just thinking, not necessarily in order, writers like Bo Goldman, who did One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. When I was talking about adaptations a moment ago, in fact, Bo Goldman once told me a story that charmed me very much. When he was doing Cuckoo's Nest, Will Sampson played a marvelous part, did a great job, but it was Will's first or second job as an actor in a major film. And he was halfway through the film when somebody told him that in the novel, Ken Kesey's novel, his part was much bigger than the part being played by Jack Nicholson. So here comes Will Sampson, and I don't know if you remember the film, but Will is a very large man.
Which part did he play? I'm not acquainted with it.
He played the inmate that was being maltreated.
Okay.
In any event, he was the huge man in the film. So he comes up to Bo, who is not a particularly athletic man, and was a bit indignant that his part wasn't bigger. So Bo very wisely pushed him off on the director and said, speak to Milo about that. There may be a mistake. And I got tickled at the way he handled it. Robert Towne is another writer I have a great deal of respect for. He did Chinatown, etc. Paul Schrader, who did Taxi Driver, and has done a number of films. There have been, in fact, it's an interesting thing. When we're talking about country music history, there's a lore to screenwriting also, going back to the days of Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur and a lot of the great early writers. Screenwriting is a very unique craft and can be an art form. I truly believe that the great films, one of my very favorite screenwriters of all time is Robert. I don't know if you saw, Lee, a film called Ryan's Daughter, but I like that because in a sense it was a slice of life. Even though it was a story film, it was a slice of life and had just about all of the psychiatric and psychological elements in it, etc. And writers like Bolt, I think, can take film from being straight entertainment to almost being an art form, and I don't mean that in the phony sense, because that film, as an example, is a very entertaining film. But it can be done, much as I believe music does it. What I personally feel is that all of the art forms, whether it's a country song or a novel or a poem, any art form, if the person doing it truly cares, does their best, and gets lucky, I think you can create art with it.
What about television? That is probably, amongst people who consider themselves very arty, the lowest form of writing and entertainment. How do you feel about that?
There's a tendency to agree with that. I don't really, for one reason. In a sense, if Shakespeare were alive today, he would probably be writing television. Where I do agree with that for me personally, but I almost feel phony saying this, I have some trouble, even though I've done a great deal of television writing. I've written for network, cable, local TV, etc. But there are constraints that are difficult. You can't, as an example, go on a show like Bonanza in its prime and kill off Lorne Greene. Now, it isn't that one would want to do that as a writer, but it's that if you didn't have those constraints, you might be able to delve a little deeper and do a little more work with character, or with story, or even with saying something about life as we all live it. It's difficult to do that. On the other hand, to deprecate it and say that it's all schlock writing, I think, is a mistake, because there are some truly delightful shows on television, and they're on constantly. The other thing I have to admit is that it does indeed reach a wide audience and isn't as simply done as it seems. I'll give you an example, and I'll go back to print to do this. The best-selling novel of all time is Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Suzanne. Many critics have great fun putting poor Jacqueline down because they think that that's tripe, not a heavy or great novel. On the other hand, to reach in excess of 20 million readers, which she did, and to tell a story the way she told it would be very difficult for many writers to do. I, as an example, could never do it. Now, I hope I'm not being defensive when I say I wouldn't particularly want to write Valley of the Dolls. I would rather write a Walker Percy novel or a Saul Bellow novel. But that's beside the point. What I'm trying to say is I don't think that Percy or Bellow could easily sit down and just pen something that would sell. So I think there's room for every market, and I think that even what people call mass cult television does fulfill a purpose. And there are also shows being done on television that I believe, Lee, are truly stimulating. And I think cable will change a lot. I don't mean cable as it is today, but I think the day will come when you almost have the cable of your choice. That's coming now, but I mean much greater extent than we have it now. Where if one, as an example, is into sports, you have a sports channel now, but I'm talking about where you'll be able to pick up almost any type of sporting event you like and almost any team you like, be it a small college or big one. The same if you're into intellectual pursuits. I think you'll be able to find that. You'll find anything you want. And also, my final comment in answer to that is that you find some very good writers making a living in television, and it's an economic base from which they often do other work, and in some cases work that will last and last. Right here, I mentioned the Writers Guild earlier. Another Writers Guild member that I know here in Nashville is a writer named Bud Wingard. I have a high regard for him, and he's been with Hee Haw now for about 13 years. I like the way Bud thinks and the way he writes. And what I'm basically saying is
more leeway. And, for instance, the Bonanza you mentioned, you've got to, in your writing, stay true to the psychology of the whole family, of how they have related on previous shows, what previous writers have added to the characters. You've got to be acquainted with all that. Did you have to go back? Would you have to go back and read a great many scripts to get all of that, just for research time alone?
Some writers do. What some others do is watch the show and get a feel from that. Another way one can do it, if you've been at the craft for a long time, you can do, in effect, in your scenario, your outline. And when you have a story meeting, then pick up the things that you may be missing.
Now the story consultant line that we see at the end of a television show, is that the person who sort of keeps all the writers in line, who has the best grasp of the characters and such as that?
If he's good, he does. He doesn't necessarily, although some of them, I'll give you an example, a man I have a huge respect for that I first met when he was a story editor as a producer named Frank Lipscomb. He's gone on to become a big wheel in the business. When I first met Frank, he was a story editor, and I met him when he was working with Hal Cantor, who was one of the all-time great television writers, a charming, erudite, and very funny man. Hal was writing in TV clear back in the days of the early George Gobel show, and he still works as much and as often as he wants. But in any event, Frank Lipscomb started as a story editor. He now has Frank Lipscomb Productions and puts out, in association with 20th, a show called Trapper John, M.D., among others. But getting back to the point, if you're working with somebody like Frank Lipscomb, you generally get tremendous input and tremendous help. There are others that are more difficult to work with.
And the other thing that would seem to make television writing difficult to me is the fact that you have to have timed segments in your story. You've got to bring it to a certain point before the commercial break to hold people's attention. Does that seem to be a drawback when writing for television?
I think it would be for many writers. It is not for me, not because I have a gift, but because it's a guideline for me, Lee. I tend, in many cases, to overwrite, and which works well in the novel and in some cases in the short story. The constraints of the commercials, station IDs, etc., often brings me in line, so to speak, in television writing. I don't think that's ever been a problem for me. I have talked to writers who wanted a little more time to really lay in a point they're about to make, but I don't think it's a major problem.
I would guess that that's where your writing of advertising and learning the conciseness of advertising would have come in handy for you and given you an advantage over other writers, and that you knew about the constraints of time already and how to condense several ideas perhaps into a very short scene.
I think that was a help, and then I think also an awareness of my own fault of overwriting helped there.
Okay, let's check out a listener here. Hello, you're live on WLAC.
I wondered if you knew Ann Howard Bailey and what she's doing now. You ever heard of her?
I will be honest, I do not know Ann Howard.
Well, I tell you, she graduated from my college I don't know, I graduated 30 years ago, and she came and spoke one day, and they said she was a television writer, so she did write that Mary Lincoln thing for channel PBS, so she's not very well known. I just wondered.
Well, I appreciate that. No, I'm sorry I didn't meet her.
Yeah, well, okay.
In fact, apropos of that question, Lee, I will say this. One of the things, I'm sorry that I haven't had the opportunity of meeting her, but very often writers, and I do not consider this a shame. I think if one really wants the glory, one should be a singer or actor. You're online there. People see you, and it's very difficult, I think, to be a performer. My heart goes out to actors, singers, etc. I am not competent to do any of those things, so I don't feel badly that writers don't get more publicity, but it is interesting that not only people on the street, but even other writers often do not know writers' works. There's a great Southerner named Natalie Johnson, born in Georgia, who did over 100 screenplays, some of them great, Three Faces of Eve, Grapes of Wrath, etc., and most people wouldn't know who Natalie Johnson was. John Briley, who won the Oscar this year for Best Screenplay with Gandhi, most people would not know his name. He's been around for some time. He did Children of the Damned, etc. And the point that I'm making is that, to me, it can be a blessing, because I am a minor American writer and not in a position to in any way have a claim to fame, but I have written for superstars and famous people, and one of the places my heart's gone out to them is even when they stop at a restaurant to get a cup of coffee. And I won't get into the thing of whether or not they owe it to their fans. I happen to think they do, but that's beside the point. But their lack of privacy is truly amazing. The other thing that I personally experienced, it's often hard to be kind when you're writing for a superstar, because you're constantly afraid that he will mistake that for flattery. So I think that in a way, writers have it luckier than they may know, because they don't have that public identification. You could take the 5 greatest writers in America and prove them in almost any restaurant, and they would not be recognized. So that may be a blessing as well as...
I would think it would be, too. You've written poetry, too. Let's get into poetry a bit. I know we probably have some poets who are listening. Almost everyone is. I see that Kevin's ready now, so we'll take our break and be right back. 10 o'clock here at WLAC. I'm Lee Stevens, sitting in for Ruth Ann Leach on vacation this week. My guest is Tom Armstrong. Tom is a writer. Nashville, has been here for 7 years, and has written a country western musical for Broadway, which we all look forward to. It would be nice to have that Nashville connection on Broadway. Have there been any plays? I know we wanted to talk about poetry, but it comes to mind. Have there ever been any plays come out of Nashville that wound up on Broadway in any way?
I think that several will. To my knowledge, to this point, they have not. But I expect that several will. Now, interestingly enough, Sugar Babies, which was a great vehicle for Mickey Rooney, and he did a dynamite job in it, did emanate from Tennessee, but it wasn't from Nashville. I think that Nashville theater, we have the $19 million Tennessee Performing Arts Center. We have Little Theater, I think, is really undergoing a boom here. We have extremely talented people here, Lee. In fact, one thing Nashville can be proud of, chap that Bev and I met both here in Nashville and in New York, named Jack Eric Williams, is doing very, very well in theater, and is a fine, fine actor. Got a standing ovation one night when he walked into Sardi's. You have people like C.B. Anderson, who was working with ETC here for a long time. He's now doing very well in New York. I think that local theater is really growing.
I've seen it since I've been here. I came in '77. Poverty Playhouse, in particular, is expanding the Nashville theater scene with some more avant-garde type of plays. Tom Stoppard, Sexual Perversity in Chicago, and right now, as a matter of fact, let's give Poverty Playhouse a plug. They're doing Butley.
I have met just recently Dennis Ewing, and I share that opinion of yours.
You're probably closer, I know you're closer to this than I am, but are you close enough to have seen it yet? A new influx of talented people into Nashville because of the expanding video scene here. Have you met many of these people yet?
I think that that's a two-way street. I have definitely seen that. And then in addition to that, when I mentioned moving here and being charmed by this community, both in terms of environment, the climate, but primarily the people, Lee, what I found is that there were talented people already here. There were people who had talent in all of the arts, and in many cases just had simply not had the exposure or the break. What I think is happening now is that there's more awareness of the varied arts, and I think that there's a wealth of talent right here in town. However, in addition to that, I do see an influx of people.
All right, we have a caller. Hello, you're live on WLAC.
Good morning.
Hi.
I'd like to know what your guest's view of the movie Nashville might have been.
Your view of the movie Nashville.
What I'm about to say is a bit prejudiced and biased statement, so please bear that in mind. I have met and talked with Joan Tewksbury that wrote that script. I have a great regard for actors, producers, directors, as I said earlier. However, Robert Altman is one of the few directors, and bear in mind this is just my personal opinion, that I would not particularly want to write for, because in my opinion he does not have a high regard for writers. I was proud of Altman for using Joan because at that point there was still a great deal of chauvinism in Hollywood regarding women screenwriters. However, when he started shooting the film, and by the way, just as an aside, I have a copy of a few pages of Joan's original script, Altman in a mass meeting told the cast, this is just a guideline. The film that came out I don't really think is what Joan wrote. She had, to me, very good insights into this city. She said things that charm me about Nashville, and this is before I came out here. So I went into the film with a bias against it, and I admit that.
Well, I was just curious because I guess in our particular section of the country, it was met with mixed emotions. There were some people who thought it was great, and some people who didn't care for it at all. And I just wondered what your view of it was.
Right. Well, I admit that that I had that prejudice that I just mentioned. The second thing was, and I find this all too often true, sometimes I think it's intentional, sometimes I think it's just a case of not knowing better, but very often plays and films and even print things that are done about country, in quotes, tend to deprecate country. Sometimes I don't think they mean to, but they take a hayseed approach, and they forget one. I've always cherished cliches, Lee, because there's a lot of truth. That's why they live. Now, granted, they get hackneyed, but their life starts and continues because almost survival of the fittest, because they say something. And I tend to feel that a lot of people see country as a hayseed thing and forget all of the folk wisdom, the talent, the beauty in it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we have someone else on the line. Hello, you're live on WLAC.
Hello?
Hello?
Tom?
Yes, go ahead.
Listen, I have got the top song. You want to hear a little of it? You're a songwriter, ain't you?
Well, Mr. Armstrong is an author. I don't think we'll be able to go into that.
Well, I heard you're a songwriter.
No, Mr. Armstrong is not a songwriter.
Well, I thought he was. He got a lady living out here where I live in Joker.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, let's go on to the poetry. Poetry is probably the most misunderstood of all the written arts. That's my opinion. And that people have difficulty reading it because of its structure. They don't understand exactly how to read a poem, and they are quite often frightened away from it in their earlier school years. What are your views on poetry?
I think you're very right. I think there's another reason for that. In fact, it's funny. I would not subscribe to this because I see all art forms as being co-equal, but there are those that feel that of the written arts, that poetry is the highest. I don't believe that, but I do believe it's the algebra of the mathematics of writing, so to speak. By that, I mean you are saying things hopefully very succinctly, and you are saying them with feeling. And it's funny in that poetry is very broad in the base that it can touch. To me, poetry ties in very well with country music. Now, I'm not speaking of the lyric line, I'm speaking of the feeling. It also ties in very well with not only philosophy, but modern scientific thought. You have people like Norbert Wiener, who was the father of cybernetics. He was a great genius, had a very interesting life, and ended up knowing Einstein and all of his fellow scientists. But the point is, early in his career, at age 10, he did a paper called The Theory of Ignorance that becomes significant because later another scientist came up with a theory of pure thought. there was a scientific joke about it that it ended up saying no one can know everything or express everything, so the best we can do is get a feel for it. The joke is worth repeating because I happen to like it. What they finally ended up telling Einstein was they had decided that there was no such thing as immaculate perception. And I like that thought, but how I'm tying that into poetry is what poetry does at its best, I think, Lee, is give us a feel for something that we may ourselves have experienced or thought about. Now, songs do that also, but I see songs as more of a collaborative or cooperative effort where you have the songwriter, the picker, the producer, the singer, and the audience, and generally the audience is multiple in nature. Very often with a love song, as an example, it's much more enjoyable if you're hearing it with someone you love. But in poetry, even love poetry, it's a very solitary experience. And so you're dealing almost with pure feeling or pure thought.
Could you give us an example of some of your poetry? Do you have something here?
I have one poem here that has been done at college campuses, etc. It's a little poem called More Than Words. It's a love poem in a sense, and it goes as follows. How do I love thee? I cannot. The bulk of pulp is not enough and is shy of love, and so am I, but not that much. I'd kiss your heart, even in front of folks.
Very nice.
Thank you.
And here you've begun with your opening line being the reverse of probably the most famous poem that's ever been written, or the one that one hears most because of its love content. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. And you
Right.
say you can't.
Right. And the reason that I did that, in fact, you and I were talking before the show started, and one of the things, Lee, that caused me to do this, it was in no way, of course, to deprecate the great Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but we were talking about the classics, and one of the things that I constantly think of as I read old novels or early poetry is they were, speaking of constraints of television, working under tremendous constraints, and modern writers have more freedom.
We'll be back with Tom Armstrong, a Nashville author. 10 o'clock on WLAC. This is the Ruth Ann Leach Show, and obviously I am not she. It's Lee Stevens substituting for the next 2 weeks while Ruth Ann's on vacation. My guest is Tom Armstrong, who is an author who lives here in Nashville. You're invited to ask questions at 737-9522. If something piques your interest, be sure and give us a call. We were talking during the news about some of the personalities that Tom has been involved with. Let's start with the Smothers Brothers. They have had a career that's been very up and down, but they've always been very, very popular with people in the country audience because of their style, their connection with folk music and such as that. How much involvement did you have with their television show?
I had a great deal of involvement with the TV show, not the original one, however, Lee. I came along later. But in addition to the folk music, Tom is really quite gifted at doing country and has an appreciation of country. To me, he's an interesting man, and that's not in any way to deprecate Dick, but I was not close to Dick. It wasn't any friction or problem.
Let's right here, before we go any further, get Tom and Dick straight in our minds. Tom is the straight man, and Dick is the comedian, or is it the other way around?
The reverse. Tom plays the part of the, quote, dummy, end quote, but in point of fact, Tom is a brilliant man. One of the things that I always was put in mind of, in fact, when I was with him, was even an early American captain of industry, because Tom Smothers was the first guy there in the morning, the last guy to leave at night, and he checked everything. He really worked with you. He was very, very kind to me. It isn't that Dick wasn't. I just didn't interact with him much. I got off on a bad foot with Tom, I might add, because in a rather obsequious way, I wanted to make points with him, obviously, because I wanted to keep writing with him. So I kept calling him Tommy, and I would work his name into every other sentence. I was with him 3 weeks when I found out that although on the air he's called Tommy Smothers, in real life he prefers being called Tom, and I'd been buttering him up with Tommies left and right for about 3 weeks. But in any event, I think that the Smothers Brothers are very significant in the history of television, Lee, because among other things, they gave so much freedom to the people they worked with, and also they spawned a host of successful people, and I'm not speaking myself. As I say, I'm a minor American writer, but many of the people that worked with Smothers Brothers went on to fame.
Can you give us a a little rundown of some of those people we might recognize?
Well, one that you could well know from the song, in fact, Gentle on My Mind, would be John Hartford, who is a gifted entertainer. And, of course, there are many others, including one of the, I don't know, have you seen the film The Man with Two Brains?
No, I haven't seen that one yet.
I haven't seen it yet. I'm blocked, I'm embarrassed to admit.
Steve Martin?
It's Steve Martin.
Did he
And
begin
many
there?
of oh yes, he was a writer for Smothers Brothers. A number of them were.
So he was a writer rather than a performer. On
Oh yes, he
Smothers
was a
Brothers.
writer with him. And so was Hartford. John Hartford was. Also, Cecil Tuck, which is not a household name as a word, but Cecil is an interesting man in that he went to college in Texas. In fact, the same college as one of our local editors, Vernell Hackett, here in town, and Dan Rather went there. Cecil and Dan were in the small college's first journalism department. They had 7 students at that time. Rather, of course, went on to fame and fortune as a newsman, and Cecil went on to become head writer of one of the Smothers shows.
Hello, you're live on WLAC.
Hey, Mr. Armstrong. Earlier you were making comments about the serious side of literature as art, try to get to deeper meanings, and how important that is, and surely that should be part of a well-rounded education. I wonder if you have any views on the attempts in certain parts of this country to censor. Even Elizabeth Barrett Browning has had her books removed from school libraries, John Steinbeck, Kurt Vonnegut, even William Wordsworth. And I'm wondering if you had any views on that.
Yes, I am sorry to see that. The reason being, I personally would not want to be involved in writing, let's say, out-and-out porn, because among other things it's very boring. But I think that censorship is, of course I'm saying a safe and obvious thing, but I wish, as I'm sure you do, that more people were aware of this. It is also a very dangerous thing that's been proven in many societies in the past. And what I personally feel about that is that literature or any art form left uncensored, 2 things tend to happen. One, it tends to censor itself. Secondly, I think audiences as a whole will eventually turn off of things that some people might think should have been censored. So I don't like to see, and in fact feel very badly about any work being censored.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. We were on the Smothers Brothers and some of the people who came out of those shows of theirs. People are always interested in the personalities of these people. Now, you say, for instance, that Tom is not the dummy that he always plays.
No, as I say, I found him to be a very, very bright, articulate man, but also I admired him because he was a hard worker. I once did a piece on rewriting as opposed to writing, and in fact, on my last trip to L.A., saw a Rolls drive by with one of those personalized license plates, and it said rewrite, and I loved it because I thought that's how the writer got that. But coming back to the point, I admired Tom because he worked very hard. I found most great singers, actors, performers, directors, writers, what have you. Now, granted, there are those people, Lee, I am far from being among them, who can sit down and knock out a great song, a great play, or put on a great show without effort and without warm-up. But I have found that most of the great performers that I have written for were terribly hard workers, and Tom Smothers is among them. And also, by the way, when I mentioned that he liked country and does it quite well when he wants to, there have been a number of great people in America long before, you know the song, I Was Country When Country Wasn't Cool. Kurt Vonnegut Jr., who is as close to an idol as you can have on American college campuses and is, in my opinion, a great writer. Kurt has been touting country music for years and years. In fact, he's a great fan of the Statler Brothers and once proposed that one of their songs be the national anthem. And I think he was somewhat serious.
Do you know which song?
I think it's Flowers on the Wall. And he is among many writers that love country. Also, just as an aside from an incident that I'm personally aware of, I have a dear friend that I went to college with who is now the director at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. He is one of the 4 leading Earth historians in the world and was written up in the front matter to Michener's penultimate novel, Covenant. But coming back to the point, here is this extremely erudite, articulate man. He's almost a typical absent-minded professor in that he has a monstrous IQ but little common sense. I love him dearly, but it's a fact. But one would think that the only music that he would like, if one were from that prejudiced base, would be classical. He adores country, and as a matter of fact, the thing I wanted to tell you is I happen to know that Lefty Frizzell was at the early man find because Dr. Van Koevering was with Louis Leakey, the Britisher. John got his doctorate from Oxford. And
okay, let's give some background on the early man find.
The early man find in anthropology is one of the truly important events of the past decade, or 20 years, I should say now. And what happened is they went down to Kenya in Africa and took with them a team of micropaleontologists, paleontologists, geologists, earth historians, anthropologists, etc. Well, Dr. Van Koevering had just picked up his doctorate from Oxford and was part of the team with Dr. Leakey. But the thing that I love and why I brought all this up was to say he is absolutely crazy about Lefty Frizzell and had some Lefty tapes with him while he was on the early man find. So it tickles me pink that David Frizzell's brother, Lefty Frizzell, was there at the early man find.
That is interesting.
And there have been a number of people. As I say, I think that country music has always been more popular than people have admitted. And I think what part of the reason has been, this is personal opinion, but sociologically across the country we seem to go in trends where there will be a point when light reading is in, or light films. I'm not insulting the movie Star Wars. I know I'm not a big friend of, but I know George Lucas. He went to SE School, sent him also. But Star Wars is not a heavy film. It says some nice things, and none of the three films are. But there seems to be periods in filming where very serious films are in, and serious where light films are in. The same is true in literature. And during those periods, some people are almost embarrassed to admit that they love country when country isn't cool. Now they're happy to come out and say they love it. I think there's been a large audience for it.
We need to take a break right here. Sorry, Kevin. We'll take a break and be back with my guest, Stephen, sitting in. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to have my guest, Tom Armstrong, who is an author who has delved into every type of writing, from a Broadway musical, which is, what would you call this stage of it?
It's been
In Search of Money.
Right.
Option for Broadway. We hope to see that by the end of 1984. He's written radio scripts, television scripts, worked with the Smothers Brothers and others. What are some of the other television things you've done?
I did the original network presentation and the pilot on The Tomorrow Show back when Tom Snyder first started on it. And strangely enough, there's a term called ghostwriter or script doctor, if you will. And it's an interesting thing, Lee. I have, in terms of, I've never become wealthy as a writer, and that is not the part. Naturally, I like money, but it isn't the primary reason I'm writing. But probably have made more money as a script doctor than any other form of income I have had. The reason for that is I did a number of TV shows, comedic shows, dramatic shows, etc. But the script doctor work, you generally get called in just before they're going to shoot, so they're under the gun, and it isn't a matter of holding them up. But particularly back when series used to run longer, you generally knew you had 26 weeks, etc., etc. Very often they would buy out a great number of scripts in bulk, and then when they got to the point where they were going to shoot them, they would have action outside the frame, or various problems, or some of the things we discussed before, problems with characterization. And that was both great training for me as a writer, and I might add, very good money for me as a writer. Another thing that it did, I don't want to keep coming back to country, but it enabled me to meet some actors and directors and people that became lifelong and dear friends. And one of them, there was a film that many in our audience may have seen on late night movie shows called The Human Duplicators. The actor in that was 7'3" Richard Keel, who ended up becoming one of my dearest friends, and Keel is a big country music buff.
Now, we might relate Keel to our audience by saying he played the part of Jaws in one of the James Bond movies.
In fact, in two of them. He's the first villain that was called back for a second Bond movie. In the history of the Bond films, they have never had the villain return. But they used Richard in two of the films, The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. And then when he finished that, he went to a film called So Fine with Ryan O'Neal, and called from New York to say that he was delighted because Warner Brothers had leased him an apartment from a pro football player, and the guy had not only left his furniture, obviously, they just leased it for the shooting of the film, but he left his record collection, and it was filled with country records, and he was very pleased about that. I did want to clarify one other thing out of embarrassment. When you talk about writing across the board or multimedia writing, that is not because I consider myself such a great writer, but I think stems from the fact that I do nothing else, because I do not act or direct or pick or sing or dance, etc. And also probably, I don't know if this would interest the audience or not, but I at least find it very difficult to put in, let us say, even an 8-hour day, let alone a 10 or a 12-hour day on a novel or a play. I find out in my career, I tend to burn out after about 4 hours of hard writing. Now, what I do is I will generally write, say I'm doing the novel I mentioned coming out through Crown after the book that Beverly and I did with Vic McAlpin. What I will do is put in 3 hours on that and then switch to a play, then switch to a country song. I have many friends that I've made here in Nashville, dear friends like Vernice Pratt, a country singer and country songwriter. Well, I may put in 3 hours on a novel and then get together with Vernice and work on a country song.
Office outside your home. Do you do your writing at the office or at home for the most part?
I do my writing at the office almost entirely. The way I got started doing it, one can write anywhere, they say, and that is probably true. But when I mentioned before burning out on a project, what I tended to find at home, and this could be laziness on my part or lack of discipline, but what I would do is I would be lackadaisical about the writing. I would feel, well, I'm working, when in point of fact I might be taking a nap or something. The very act of getting up and driving down to Music Row, going into the office, I feel like it's a job, and I do the job, and it is indeed a job, it's work. The second thing is, when I keep saying how much I like the people here, to me, maybe even more than somebody who's native born, there's an actual charm that I feel just driving on me as you go. It pleases me. It pleases me to see the row and to see the people. And it gives me the interchange with songwriters, with various writers.
By going to the office and working there, do you not have a problem with interruption of people stopping by quite often?
People do stop by, but in a funny way, that is not the problem. It could be. People talk about the concentration of writing, but in point of fact, I find that even when you're all alone, I speak for myself at least, that I may delude myself, and in fact I keep a day timer, I'm digressing, but and chart my hours. Yesterday I had 11 hours of so-called writing time. I credited myself with 6 3/4. The reason is, even had I not had people come in and talk, which did happen, I find that I daydream. I talk to my wife about something that has nothing to do with writing. I will be looking up a reference, which is part of the job, become enchanted with what the reference work says, and read maybe a whole chapter beyond what I needed, and that's just personal joy.
We'll take a break now. We'll be back with Mr. Tom Armstrong, a writer who is now resident in Nashville, 7 years now, so we will consider him a Nashville native, who writes now on a very, very national scale, not only through the television, but with that Broadway option. Do you need an introduction here? Then I'll just tell him it's the CBS Business Update coming along. Tom is a writer and just told me something I did not know. You seem to be very busy. You say you have a novel that is it completed?
No, Lee, what I'm doing now on the novel, have outlined the entire novel. I'm about 25% of the way finished with the novel. What I did, the Vic book that I mentioned, the book with Vic McAlpin, From Defeated Creek to Music City, USA, will be coming out through Crown Publishing in New York. When we went back on that book, I took them a basic outline and the beginning of the novel and cut an oral deal on the book, and on the strength of that came back to finish it.
So you have a play option for Broadway. You have a book on the history of country music that's coming out. You have a novel in progress that's well along its way. And you mentioned during the break that you also have a television series that is being considered. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yes, how that came about. the word workaholic is an abused word, and sometimes people who use it in a braggadocio sense. I see that in myself as part of a neurotic persona, if you will, but nonetheless, I am more comfortable writing than doing a lot of other things, so I write pretty much between 5 and 15 hours a day. When we finished with the radio history of country music, we had been meeting early in the morning, and by we I mean Beverly Beard, Michael Kosser, and myself. So I thought, well, we've got a good flow going, we should do something else. Well, I've written for various television shows, but I've never had a series of my own. I keep talking about how in love with Nashville I am. I thought I would like to do a show that was a good show about country music in Nashville and see it go network. I don't have all the clout in the world, but I'm with a very strong agent. I'm with Diamond Artists, and they've got Tony Randall, Jack Klugman, Vince Edwards. They had David Jansen for 20 years before his death. And I happen to know, because I'm with that agency, I had known some months before it hit the press that Quincy was going off the air. So I started talking to them about doing a television series, and they were very encouraging. So Bev and Michael and myself I did the network presentation, the three of us did the pilot, and then we did 6 outlines for the upcoming shows. I sent that to my agent, and then subsequently I've been back on 3 occasions for meetings with them. And this does not mean, once again, like the show being optioned for Broadway, it does not mean we have a network series. It means we have a very good shot at a network series.
Now, the series that you're talking about, it is Nashville-based, the storyline?
What I would like to see them do is shoot in excess of 50% of it in this city, because that's partly out of just a love for my adopted community and the community that's been so good to me, but then also for authenticity. It is a music-centered show. It's not a musical, but it is centered around the music business. It's a little bit like a country music Hill Street Blues. It's not a cop show, and we didn't lift it from Hill Street Blues because, bear in mind, we had started working on that before Hill Street Blues popped. But it's that type of storyline where you have some humor, some drama, a lot of the psychology of people interacting, rather fast pace, and subplots concurrently running with the plot. I personally like that type of writing, and I think the audience does, where you're telling a story up here, but you're also showing little things or pointing to little things below that.
Are you going to point out little things on Music Row in this series?
I hope in a good sense, yes.
How do you go about presenting that? How do you get that to a network executive who can seriously consider it? Strictly through your agent work?
In my case, I do it in a dual way. The fact of the matter is, I love writing with all of my heart, but one of the things that I was a slow learner about, Lee, was that the business of writing is, I think, 70% business and 30% writing. It took me a long time to realize how important it was to have a good support team and to respect and work well with that team. Now, I've been with Diamond Artists for 12 years. They're very, very good to me, and I appreciate that. But there are places where I can't get in the door, where my agent can walk in. The second thing is, you really come off a braggart when you walk into a producer and say, I've got the hottest property you've ever seen. Some writers do that. I tend to feel it backfires. Your agent can, however, do that. Secondly, on the money, you've got no business, in my opinion, trying to negotiate the money. What I do is, through knowing people over a period of years and writing for different shows, in cases of people like Frank Glicksman, as an example, that I mentioned, of Frank Glicksman Productions, I will, both out of friendship, being happy to see them, and out of the selfish reason of wanting them to get on my show, I will go to them, tell them about it, and then say, would you mind if I had Guy call you? Guy is our Guy Steiner, who is my agent with Diamond Artists.
So there are in Nashville, I'm sure, many people who are working on projects about which no one knows and no one will ever know, probably because they don't know enough about the business end of writing. And you say that you yourself took a long time to come to that realization. What sort of tips would you give to our aspiring writers as far as learning about the business end?
I would definitely advise them to get an agent for the following reason. I'll talk a little more about how hard that is, but the reason that I would advise that, taking even print media, novels, there's a novel out now called Second Heaven by a fine lady named Judith Guest. Her first novel was a great novel called Ordinary People. Came out through Vantage. It was the first book in 29 years that they published as an over-the-transom book. In the trade, what over-the-transom means is it means that you write the manuscript for a novel and send it in without an agent and without any clout. You're not married to the publisher's daughter or son. You don't know anybody there, and you have no connection at all. You're almost dead in the water trying to do that. It's sad but true, because they're constantly besieged. They get in excess, this may surprise the audience, but there are over 1 million manuscripts per year sent out. Those mostly do not get read, and it's sad because you said something I like a minute ago, that there are some very fine people writing some very fine things, and they will never be heard. That makes me sad, but it's true. There are people sitting at home writing great work, I believe, and they're just not discovered. There are also people writing trash, and I admit that, but there are people writing good things, but they just do not know enough about the business that they'll never get a hearing, and it's sad. So first of all, I would tell anybody who is an aspiring writer that they really should try to get an agent that believes in them. Now, that's easier said than done, because agents get besieged with manuscripts also, but that is a possibility and a definite one. I will give you an example. There are books at your library that will list what they call the A and B agents. Now, my agent is an A agent. I don't say that to brag. I say it to make the following point. They do not take unsolicited manuscripts. I really wish they did. In fact, I also wish they'd open a Nashville office, and they don't, and that makes me mad. But other than that, I love them. But the point is, if a writer who had no track record sent my agent a manuscript, it would come back, and that's sad. However, the books break them down. A B agent, that doesn't mean they're not as good. It simply means that their door is open, and you stand a chance of getting discovered. That's even better than being discovered by a publisher, Lee, because if your agent thinks that he has found in the good Lee Stevens a great American writer, he will push you to every publisher and to the magazines as well as the books, and there are all kinds of doors that open to you.
Does one have to go to New York or Los Angeles to find an agent?
I do not believe that one does. Number one, you can do it by mail. Number two, there are agents locally, and when we were talking earlier about local talent, there are more and more agencies springing up in Nashville, and that delights me. Now, some of them, and this is not to deprecate them at all, some of them are not yet signatory to Writers Guild of America and similar organizations. The only reason that that would bother one is that some television shows will not deal with a writer if he's not a member of Writers Guild. It's a vicious circle. It's much like the SAG thing. SAG is Screen Actors Guild. Theoretically, one cannot get a job in a feature motion picture shot in Hollywood as an actor if you are not a member of the Screen Actors Guild. On the other hand, you can't become a member of SAG without a part. Now, the way people overcome that is they go to their friend, producer Lee Stevens, and has him write a letter saying, Tom C. Armstrong is the only person who would fit in this part. I take the letter to SAG and sign a little slip of paper that says that I will indeed join as soon as the picture is shot. And the Writers Guild works much the same. You have to have X number of credits to become a member. To my knowledge, the only two members of the Guild in Nashville right now are Bud Wingard, the hee-haw writer I mentioned, and myself. But I think that tons of Nashville writers will become members of the Guild. And I have to confess there's a downside to being a WGA member also, Lee, and that is the following. You cannot work for less than WGA scale if you're a member, and there are many shows being shot that either won't or in many cases can't pay Guild minimum. So you lose certain jobs that way.
And we have now the Nashville Network in our city. Do you know enough about their organization to know whether they are they will take non-guild members as writers?
They take non-guild members. As a matter of fact, I know many people over there and have a great respect for them. They've got some very good people. Directors like Dennis Glore, who's, in my opinion, a fine director. And they have some good people over there and some good Nashville people. Up until recently, a man named Paul Corbin just took over Nashville Network. When I say took over, I mean in an executive capacity, from Elmer Alley, who is a great Nashvilleian who, as a matter of fact, worked with Owen and Harold Bradley years ago in the original country music work being done as a studio engineer. However, the Nashville Network, once again, either because they won't or can't at this point budget guild minimum, they work primarily with non-guild members.
So a guild member who is in Nashville could not work with them? Is that part of your contract with the Writers Guild?
There's a complicated way that you can do it, which it isn't a matter of being evasive. It's too long and boring to go into now, but as in theory, one could not, right?
When dealing with someone like the Nashville Network, what is the local writer, unknown local writer's best chance of getting something to that particular organization, from your experience?
What I would advise him to do, and my advice may not be worth anything at this point, but what I would do is take what I consider to be my best television writing and perhaps even go to the trouble of doing something for one of their shows, a little sample of writing, call and make an appointment and take A, my best work, and B, the sample work for them, and take that to them. And I think that they would be receptive. I certainly have no right to speak for them. I'm just saying I think they're good people over there and would give you a break.
Do they, would you think the organization would prefer an outline of your script rather than an actual finished script?
I don't know what let's go to, if we may, for a moment, let's go to from Owen Bradley forward. But many of them will say, well, Tom, I can hear through a song, so just bring me a guitar and a voice. In point of fact, I've found that it seems easier to place the song if you've got the studio demo. The same is true in television writing. Most producers and production houses will tell you, well, Lee, if you'll bring me an outline of the show you've got in mind, that's all I need. Or bring me a scenario on your great film. I can work from that. In point of fact, I find that they do not work from that very often, and you're much better to take a script. The second reason, if you really love your project enough, let's say you're doing a movie that you, Lee Stevens, are, I think you're better to do the whole film. The only thing that I do that's a little different, and this isn't just a trick of mine, in fact, I know Paul Schrader, who's one of the greatest screenwriters in the business, does it, and I know one or two others do. I generally write two scripts. One is an abridgment. Most films run about 160 pages on paper. That's a rough. I will do one at 160. I'll do one at 110. Now, the reason I do that is producers are human. When they go home on Friday night, they like the secretaries and their friends to see how hard they work, so they'll carry about 8 scripts home. In point of fact, they will not read 8 scripts that weekend, and I found often they read the shortest one first. So I've got a script in there that's 110 pages. Now, then they often will call Guy, my agent, and say, well, the script's good, but it looks like the running time's a little short. Well, I happen to have in my hip pocket 160-page script.
That's very interesting. Also, how can a beginning writer protect himself when he is not published yet, as far as copyrights and the theft of ideas and such?
There are many ways. One, now, you do not have to be a member of the Writers Guild to register material with the Guild. They charge you if you're a non-member, but the charge is not that high. When I lived in Hollywood, it was about $7.50, It's probably under $20 still. If you're a non-member for a minimal fee, something between $7.50 and $10, $20, whatever it is now, they will register that, and they will indeed give you strong backup. There are other little tricks you can do. You can mail things to yourself. I don't find that effective. You can also go to the trouble of copywriting your work, but there you're spending some time and money. But also, interestingly enough, I do not find the amount of theft that some people seem to be concerned about. Good ideas, and this may sound strange, and this once again is my opinion. I'm not saying everybody would believe this, but good ideas in effect are a dime a dozen. What really is difficult is the execution. It is so easy for you and I to sit down and say, I got a great idea for a movie. But then when we go to fill 160 blank pages of paper and see, well, how are we going to make this happen and that happen, and how are we going to fill this void, that's what's tough. So I don't really find that much theft. It does happen. There's song theft, there's script theft, but I don't find that much of it.
Need to take a break right now. We'll be back with Tom Armstrong, a Nashville author who has many things in the works. If you have some questions about the craft of writing or the business end of writing, I'm sure Tom could give you some guidance on that if you'd like to call us at 737-9522. We'll be right back. Armstrong, songwriter, playwriter, novel writer, script writer. He's written just about anything, so whatever the area that you're interested in as a writer, he might have some tips for you, as he's just given us a few about getting movie scripts into producers and such as that, and getting them to actually read it. That's a bigger problem perhaps than just having them take the scripts, is to actually know they're going to read it. I would think quite often they'll take it perhaps just to get someone off their back, so to speak, who's very aggressive about trying to get it to them, and then probably never read it. Does that happen?
In Music City, one of my favorite Vic McAlpin stories. Vic, as I said, was around and knew almost everyone in the country music business, and he wants to prove that point, took a song in and had glued the tape. Now we generally work with cassettes, but in those days we were working with reel-to-reel tape. He glued the tape to the box it was in, dropped the song off, and came back about 5 days later to get an opinion. They said, well, they were going to pass on the song, but they had enjoyed it. And he asked them how he played it because it was still glued in.
Interesting. Hello, you're live on WLAC.
Hi, I'm really enjoying this show.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask Mr. Armstrong his opinion on a couple of things, and then I want to hang up and listen to the answers. Will that be okay?
Certainly, go right ahead.
Okay, what, in your opinion, is the reason that every time a super good show comes along, I mean, other than the masses, I already know that answer, but for example, St. Elsewhere. I watched an episode last night that I thought was tremendous, far above average for evening television fare. That show gets preempted all the time. I know, like I know my own name, it is not going to stay on the air. I don't understand why television can't select a few really top-notch shows, and the heck with the ratings, leave them on for the value of the show itself. Family was nowhere near as well received, I don't think, as the quality of the show. My other thing that I would like him to discuss is I'm very interested in credits. I read the credits almost always in a movie and very frequently on television, with particular interest to the casting director. Believe this or not, very frequently I can tell who cast something before the credit comes up. And I'm, interested in the cinematographer and also the writers, and I get very exasperated with television that runs the credits too fast for you to read. It really is exasperating. So I'll hang up now and hear the discussion on those two subjects.
All right, thank you.
If I may, I'll take the latter point first. Number one, I would like to thank you for watching those credits because I share that with you. I always watch them. Many people don't. I will stay after while the credits are running during a movie, as an example. Part of the reason that they run those credits so quickly is because they are under time constraints. Part of that, of course, is to run commercials, et cetera, et cetera. Part of it gets back to the agent. One can, through one's agent and personal manager, etc., when I talked about having a support team, you can specify certain things on your credits. You will notice occasionally you will see a credit where they seem to freeze on it for a moment. Now, what that generally means is that the agent has a clause in the contract that says that your credit will be a certain size and hold for a certain length. As a writer, and I can only speak as a writer, the best way to do that is to tie yourself into somebody other than a superstar and get your agent to say that you will not have less credit than so-and-so. That's not an innovative idea I thought up, but a lot of people fail to do it, and it's clever to this extent. Let's pretend the actor or actress with third billing is a fairly strong actor or actress. You know that their agent's going to protect them. So without alarming the network people, when your agent negotiates, he simply says, well, now bear in mind, we don't want too much, but Tom does want the same size and length of credit as the good Lee Stevens gets. It's not that alarming at that point. When they go to editing the final film, however, if they hold Lee's credit for a minute, which they wouldn't, but I'm saying then they would have to hold mine. But in any event, I'm glad you watched it. On the first point, I share with you a sadness about so many top quality shows going off the air. I think that really, as you say, the obvious answer is to try to allude to the masses, but another thing that happens, television does tend to be a copycat medium. And because there are more so-called schlock shows on, whether they are or aren't, networks often get frightened when their show is too different. Another thing that I have to blame the writers for, though, even on the quality shows, including myself, once you get a show going that's doing well and it is a thoughtful show, be it Smothers Brothers or any other show, what we sometimes do is we get very proud of ourselves and perhaps try to be too erudite or too clever. And that either alarms the network people or costs them some audience, and they will then, of course, bomb you out. I think what's going to cure that in part is as cable grows and grows, I think there will be whole networks that will simply delight people who are particularly watching for that type of quality. I think it'll open up avenues for writers all over the United States.
I would certainly agree with that. Television seems to be going from that mass appeal audience to the very specialized audience, and of course that's only been made possible by the growth of cable. We've had the CBS Arts Network, which I believe did not continue for more than a year or two. But in future, when the network executives, producers, and the business end of television and radio can specialize and want to aim a particular show and therefore the advertisement at a particular segment of the society, we can see more quality shows or simply more shows that appeal to us personally across the TV spectrum.
I believe that very much, Lee. I think another thing will happen, when we talked a little bit earlier about censorship, it's a funny thing. Shows can glut themselves out of the market, and so it's the problem or question of quality, frankly, is very subjective. And a saying that I learned in Nashville, by the way, is that everybody has an opinion. I won't even finish the saying, but everyone has an opinion. And this is true, so it's very difficult to say what is really quality. But I will say this, if we did set that standard that we all agreed was a quality show, and the majority, the statistical skew was toward non-quality, after a time it gluts the market, and even the so-called mass audience will start swaying toward quality at that point. So I do think that there's great hope, and also, as you say, specialized type of advertisers will go for a certain type of show. The ad agencies, there's another field that people often put down, and yet the agencies' market research people truly do some brilliant work. NFL football for a long time drew the highest income audience of anything on television. People didn't know that. Market research went through a lot of work in film and television, and in print, by the way. For a long time, people were doing surveys where they would go door to door. They would hire college students, and they would ask the lady or man of the house, what publications do you subscribe to? Well, it was amazing that the readership of Harper's, Atlantic, Saturday Review, etc., was astounding in the multi-millions, which in point of fact, of course, wasn't the case. So a man named Dichter came along, who was a research psychologist, and he changed the survey format. What they now do, they ask at the door, but then they say, would you mind if I stepped in while I fill out my questionnaire? Well, they are seated. The only publications they put down are ones that they visually cite. They ignore the oral answer. Well, they found out that books like Red Book were indeed outselling Atlantic, which they knew from the print run. Well, they're doing the same type of market research now, very sophisticated work on television audience viewing habits and what type of demographic breakdown you have, how many of those people, in point of fact, might buy your product. And I think that will help every kind of show, quality and non-quality.
One of the basic problems has always seemed to be that the sponsor is concerned with reaching the most people. And that, since the money comes from the sponsor, has influenced a lot of the shows to gear themselves toward more people, which means that you can't be very specific. What do you think about writers? A good writer should, I think, be able to influence the public toward his point of view. That's one of the reasons one writes. And it can be done without, as they say, hitting people over the head with a hammer, getting a didactic point across without didacticism, getting it in so it's palatable and enjoyable. And it seems to me like quite often that is forgotten when you let sponsors in to say, no, we don't want to talk about that. It might offend this segment of the population or that segment of the population. So the specialization of cable should help us take care of that problem.
I think two things, Willie. One, the specialization of cable. Secondly, there are already some sponsors, God love them, that are really doing a service. One would be the Hallmark Hall of Fame as an example. Hallmark is actually theoretically losing money. Advertising agencies speak in CPM or cost per thousand. Well, when you run a show like Hallmark Hall of Fame, your CPM is very high. It costs them a lot of money for the people they reach because their playhouse does not reach the great audience that, let's say, they could reach with Dukes of Hazzard. I'm not trying to deprecate Dukes of Hazzard, but there's a show that reaches a lot of people. But Hallmark chooses to run that show anyway, and more advertisers are moving by. I don't mean there are hordes of them, but more and more are. Mobile is beginning to Xerox, right? And certain large, and they're getting a secondary benefit from that, if you will, and that is almost a prestige type of thing. Once again, quality is like opinion; it's very subjective, but there is a prestige fallout where people then begin to associate that product not only with the show they saw, but with the type of management that cares enough to want to present that type of show. Mobile's done some work on that, and it's working very nicely.
Well, our time is just about up. I'd like to thank Tom Armstrong, who is an author.
Rededication. Ingress. Birth is an affirmation of life and hope, a rededication to the pursuit of ultimate values. This work is dedicated to my first grandchild, now in my daughter's womb. My grandchild will, of course, be endowed with this ancestor's heritage, myths, and memories as a part of its own. I do not now know, nor need to know, my grandchild's gender, nor do I desire an advance on its unique future. I do, however, wish this beloved human being to be a life of dedication. For true dedication, my grandchild, is a gift shared by the giver. This is for my grandson, Giovanni Thomas Fanera, born 8:26 a.m., Sunday, September 5th, 1993, the week this book went to press, and for my beloved friend, Brenda Bagel, for letting me sneak it in well past deadline. God regarding grandchildren. Your grandchildren provide a little bit of heaven on earth. Pawpaw is a young man's game. For my beloved grandson, Giovanni Thomas Fanera. I'm on my hands and knees with my grandson on my back. I get to be the horse as we trot the household track. Next, we're racing through his toys. Well, to cut right to the chase, he's barely getting started, and I'm falling on my face. Hi, guys. Oh, the men in my life. Paternal ancestors who came over on the Mayflower. Sebastian Armstrong, who was a Nashvilleian generations before me. My daddy, Pop, I remember the time, and the time, and the time. My no-legged old Grandpa Armstrong worked for the railroad, lost them both to a train. Grandpa Chris Christensen came over from the old country, Denmark, and first stayed at the Yemsey Hotel. Most of us call it the YMCA. My two brothers, one older, one younger, my friends and buddies and cohorts, then and now, now and then. And now, new from our maker, Giovanni Thomas Fanera, 7 months old, your lines and your story yet to come. But this is not a line. Papa loves you, Giovanni, as close to unconditionally as conditions allow. Hi, Guy. For my beloved grandson, Giovanni Thomas Fanera. Grandchildren, the life of the party of life. For my beloved granddaughter, Katie, Katerina Marie Fanera, born 8:41 a.m., Sunday, September 7, 1997. Granddaughter, great karma Daria, and good karma to boot. Katie's Kaleidoscope. Once upon a when, in the land of where, Katie and I have both dreamt there, while doing what and visiting with who, Katie noticed a kangaroo. As kangaroos go, it wasn't a slouch, but something odd was in its pouch. No, it was not a kangaroo baby. Odd, yes, odd, I don't mean maybe. A gift, perhaps, from a kangaroo guy? There had to be a how and why, for in that pouch was a kaleidoscope. Not a common one, nix, nay, no. No, because it let seeking viewers see the essence of reality. As our Katie knew she was born to seek, she felt she ought to take a peek. More than a peek, she thought, a long, long look, treated as a beloved book. So Katie wished, hoped, and visualized that her desire be realized. Importantly, she acted on her hope to study that kaleidoscope. Miss Kangaroo, please, dear Miss Kangaroo, I've a favor to ask of you. Say no more, for you shall have your favor. Take it, here, it's yours to savor. It wasn't meant for a kangaroo pouch. It often made me holler, ouch. How'd she know my wish? Our Katie wondered. Still she knew she hadn't blundered. Having made her request with courtesy, she'd not now pry, mystery. So profusely thanking Miss Kangaroo, our Katie with her gift withdrew to a quiet spot alongside a brook. Now at last she would get to look at her treasured gift, her kaleidoscope. See, there is always hope for hope. Katie sat on a rock shaped like a cube. Her deft hand kept turning the tube. As she peered through the eyepiece, gasped, sigh, wow. What she saw changed and changed somehow. It was one pattern after another. Wait until she showed her brother. The colors ranged from those in common use to ones such as chartreuse and puce. The mix of colors was so beautiful and patterns were so plentiful that Katie realized she'd found a clue to something she just knew was true. Unless the kaleidoscope told her so, how Katie knew, I'll never know. But she called, Pawpaw, and I came running. What she said to me was stunning. Our Katie had had an epiphany. She said, Pawpaw, reality has a job. It's change. It keeps on changing, much as this gift keeps arranging patterns when I turn it thus. Well, a whiz might say that reality is energy changing through diversity, and as I grow, it changes me. Ah, Katie, I said, you're very nimble. Your kaleidoscope's a symbol, reminding us that change is not so strange. In fact, over time, all things change. But people who forget forget-me-nots, oh, and perhaps leopard spots. Good books make time stand still for me and you, so reading's an exception too. And this won't change, not ever, matey. I love books. and I love Katie.